Tom, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to get into some stuff today.
Yeah, so you're up actually working with previous guest Rusty Earnshaw, and you're up in Sedbergh. So what's going on up there? What have you been guys working on at the moment?
We're doing some coaching. So we're coaching hundreds of kids actually across 3 weeks, which is really cool. Some courses that run across rugby, which is what Rusty and I are working on, but there's other sports as well. So it's a cool environment because getting to interact a whole load with coaches from other sports, which is not something that I've done a whole load of, having spent a whole career in a Rugby Sevens environment pretty much. But it's a tough act to follow, Rusty. Following on the podcast from him is not going to be easy. So yeah, I'll do my best. But he's actually been spending much of these 3 weeks taking the mick out of me for hosting Q&A. A few of the other coaches thought the boys would find it interesting to hear about some of my career. So now he's just finding opportunities to take the mick about that.
Brilliant.
Totally fair enough.
Just dropping you in the deep end, man. That's all you need.
Oh, big time.
So you're working with rugby and you're working with a lot of kids. I'm actually always curious in what other people are seeing in younger athletes. Can you see a difference in the young kids that you're seeing now to almost what you would have experienced when you were younger?
Firstly, I didn't really experience anything like the offering that I tend to work in terms of coaching camps and stuff that I tend to deliver are amazing opportunities for them at their age, like from sort of, 10, 11, 12, all the way up to 17, 18, to have the experience of, being around other people, the level of learning that is available to them, like in rugby that we're trying to deliver is amazing, fantastic. For people, the young people who have got aspirations to go on and play at the top level, it's an amazing springboard. In terms of the way the players and the young people are, there's a couple of things we've talked about and we're noticing. One is around the higher levels of introverted behavior. So I think there's some studies that you probably shouldn't quote me on this. I'm sure you can pull out the research, but I think there's some evidence that there are more introverts than extroverts now in young people, and how we react to that as coaches and stuff is really important to understand. But also, there's the distraction of these things, these phones.
Yeah.
These are interesting things to manage for young people. I think they're a really useful tool, but can be really difficult. I think they provide a very easy way to detach and to be distracted. And sometimes that's not useful for young people. But I'm learning a hell of a lot. Like working with young people, it's a great, first it's useful for my parenting life because I've got a 2-year-old. So I'm having a lot of moments thinking, I wonder if my parenting right now is going to benefit him or not in the future. But it's also useful because I think working with kids actually helps you work with adults, because I'm a big believer that ultimately adults are largely kids in grown-up bodies. Like we still hold on to a lot of those same emotional responses. Obviously, a lot of our thought process and our behaviors are dictated by our early experiences as children. So sometimes I find it's not in a belittling sense, but sometimes I find it's useful to observe adults and ourselves, by the way, in a sense of this reaction is almost as if as a child would react to this scenario. So let's sort of manage it accordingly. And again, I'm not saying that means you dismiss it or belittle it, but it helps us make sense of some of our emotional reactions sometimes.
What have you kind of stumbled on when it comes to managing the slightly more introverted? I agree, by the way. I actually do agree that the introverted, from what I'm just seeing, I don't know, I haven't delved into any of the research or the studies, but I'd be highly shocked if that wasn't true, that there were more introverts right now, because I'm seeing it. I just see general younger people coming into, whether it's senior groups, that are a little bit less sure of themselves. And do you know what? One of the other things I think about it is there's two parts to it, right? It doesn't mean you have to be extroverted to be amazing. You don't have to be loud and shouting it. I've got some of my favorite teammates and my best performing teammates were heavily introverted people. I think we just think that the extroverts are the ones that are they're the golden kids, or they're the X Factor players and the Mavericks, right? And while they might be entertaining to watch, they may not be consistent. They may not have all of those attributes that are actually beneficial. And the other bit is the fact that you don't have to try and mold yourself into being something that you're not. You don't have to mold yourself into thinking, if I am introverted, then I've got to make myself be extroverted to get there. So what have you sort of, as a group that are working there at the school and with Russell at the moment, what do you, out of those discussions, what do you think you're falling on to help with people who are introverted?
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting one because it highlighted probably a few biases. So just going back to the research, I think a couple of the reasons I've already mentioned, but obviously COVID and children's experience of COVID is contributing to this, but and the lockdowns. The bias thing is funny because as you were speaking then, it reminded me at school, we did like a personality profiling questionnaire. Probably wasn't very accurate, but I actually just remembered there was a question in it and it was to do with like introversion, extrovert. And I had the impulse that being extrovert was a better one than being introverted. And like it was supposed to be an objective thing. But there was some sense in me that the extroverts were the cool kids, the popular kids. There was something going on there that had probably suggested that was a better way to be. And I think we probably carry some of that it's curious. I don't know where it comes from, but that has probably manifested itself in society in general. Like we feel like people are extroverted. It means they must be confident. It must mean that they have it all figured out. Whereas a lot of extroverted behavior might not necessarily, be reflective of what's happening inside. But yeah, it's a really hard one with coaching as well, because I think coaching is a lot about what feedback you're getting from the players right around you. Extroverts tend to give off a lot of obvious feedback, which informs your coaching. I think introverts by nature don't. So you have to notice things in a different way. You probably have to be a bit more skillful in your questioning. And it probably requires a bit more skill as a coach. It doesn't come as easy. So that's probably the first thing. I think being at peace with people who are introverted and like not trying to change them, like you've kind of hinted at, it is a great lesson and a great starting point. See how people interact in a game, in training, whilst being themselves. Because ultimately that's what we want, right? We want people to behave on the sports pitch as their most comfortable selves. Like in an ideal world for me, the sports arena, whatever your sport is, would be this place where you can feel most yourself and feel your whole self. So for a lot of people, that might be their whole introverted self. And we have to create room for that and be at peace with that, even though it might not look and sound like a session, like we think a session should.
Yeah, I'm actually really excited about doing my research project that is coming up for the end of my master's. And we've started to really get about 80% of the way to the question that we want to ask. And one of them is, it essentially is based around perfectionism. People that would have listened to the show know that I have a really keen interest in perfectionism. I speak about it a lot. I've had researchers on that are leaders in the area. And
we'll definitely get into that because I've got some things on.
Awesome, yeah. So I am looking at what's called other orientated perfectionism. So essentially, a coach's perfectionism placed onto an athlete. So I want you to be perfect, or you could be a leader, could be a captain, right? Could be someone that I want you to be perfect. And we're going to look at what's the impact on the athlete and their own self-orientated perfectionism, so their own perfectionistic standards and strivings. Like, I now want to be perfect because the coach has told me to be perfect, and its impact on whether that increases their fear of failure, whether they take more risks. But the other area we're looking at, and it's around risk-taking, and anyone that's listening to the show, please get in touch if you can think of what this next factor might be, is that we're looking around something around freedom of expression. So essentially, to do something like free of, without care of what other people think, really, and it's built into that risk-taking factor. So it might be, I'll use a scenario in cricket, my sport, where you're batting. Perfect
metaphor for it right now, probably with the way England cricket's going.
So it's essentially built on their way they're playing. Like this has been it's been an inspiration for this question. But essentially, imagine you're a batsman and you're facing a spinner, and you, in your mind, your free expression that you want to do is to run down the wicket and hit the ball for 6 over the top. You actually know that that's a good option. Like you've practiced it, you know tactically that's the right thing, and for you to do that is the most authentic expression. But something inside you, whether it's the coach's perfectionism, whatever it might be, is telling you, take the safe option, take the easy option, which is trying to play like a tentative defensive shot and block it into the covers. But when you do that, you potentially become stiff and you mis-execute the skill and you could get outright. I've seen so many athletes and cricketers that say, oh, I wish I'd taken the option, that I knew what the right one was and I just didn't take it. I don't know if you've ever experienced that in rugby, whether rugby players get similar things. I think of sort of wingers taking certain lines of attack and whether there's an easy, a safer option rather than sort of the one that they know deep down they want to take. Have you ever experienced something like that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can tease out like a specific, but I totally know what you're talking about. And I guess I kind of describe it as when you get locked into the pitfall of trying to think your way through a game rather than the instinctive knowing. There's the kind of like instinctive gut knowing, and then there's the thinking through. And the thinking through is always, generally speaking, is too slow, like in the moment, right? It doesn't happen quick enough. So very rarely works out to be a good outcome. But you say, I mean, this is naff, but like curiosity killed the cat is the traditional expression. Well, I don't think curiosity did kill the cat. I don't know what the story is behind that expression, but whatever. But hesitation, now that would kill some cats. And often you see it in training when you're trying to change some stuff in training, and there's like, oh, is this the right decision? Oh, maybe not. Okay, I'll do it anyway. But by that time, it's too late, and that hesitation killed you. Whereas actually, if you'd either done it first time, or you decided not to do it first time and done something else, you probably would have ended up with a better outcome. So, we used to talk about that a lot. Like, best is the top of the tree is the right decision. The next thing is actually the wrong decision. And the bottom of the pile is no decision. You often see it in rugby, hesitation, that like no decision making moment very rarely leads to anything good. Whereas often you might say, oh, there was probably a better decision you could have made there. But because you 100% went through with what you decided to do, it became a good outcome. You kind of turned it into a good outcome. So we used to talk about that, like right decision, wrong decision, no decision, in that order. But yeah, I know exactly what you mean about that gut, the doubt. I guess I think, so I'm not wanting to move this forward too quickly, but I think it comes from what lives in your kind of deeply rooted beliefs a lot of the time, about your environment, the world, and yourself, to a large degree. Anything on that before I'm very mindful I could dive into my own experiences like that, perfectionism thing.
Yeah, so I mean, perfectionism is really at the heart of people that doubt themselves. It's like, why take this option when I risk being imperfect, or technically I'm perfect and safe as I am when I don't do anything. So why take the risk and go into doing anything? I actually had a really interesting conversation with a group of, I was giving a keynote yesterday. There's a group of young female cricketers that are trying to make it in their way. And anyone that's listened to the podcast or knows my story, I'm not going to dive into it, but knows some of the things I had to overcome to get to where I did. And part of the questioning that I get usually after a keynote is that they will ask, oh, you seem like you could just sort of break down through walls, and sort of you were confident, you just were persistent, and this was sort of like innate for you. And I said, well, no, this is actually, it was the opposite. I was so scared of taking a risk. I was so scared of putting myself out there, so anxious, because there was this voice telling me that, and that's come from an environment, that's come from interactions, that's come from my own standards and just worries and anxieties. And I had to actively break out of it, to actively change who I was bit by bit. Now, I'm not saying I was going to the gold standard straight away, but it was like small incremental steps. I'll just try this little tough thing today, and then I'll try something slightly tougher tomorrow and slightly tougher the next day. And then now starting to build up some momentum. And then I'm now 33, and I wouldn't really think about some of those things that I would have definitely worried about loads as a kid.
Yeah, that resonates. I mean, I have been told countless times since I was young and like at school, oh, you seem so confident doing that. And I probably would like, yeah, yeah. But the degree of anxiety that was hanging around me, and it's probably quite common, but the problem is I was quite good at acting through it, I guess. And the problem is the more you act through those scenarios, you actually, you're probably then more reluctant to meet your, whatever is the root of the anxiety and stuff, because but you're still promoted to those situations where you're going to be up in front of people, for example. So like, I speak in front of the school quite a lot when I was at school, and people thought, I was quite confident with it or quite relaxed, but that was largely a facade. But the problem is then you end up doing more and more of that stuff and kind of faking it till you make it. But if you never actually address the root cause of the anxiety, you just carry that around with you, and then it's not particularly enjoyable experience, because then the only nice feeling once you've come out the other side of it is just relief. And like, really, you kind of want something more than relief at the end of those moments. But the root of that for me was this like inbuilt desire to want to be perfect, and not just perfect at rugby. Actually, it was kind of weird with wanting to be the best at everything. But I was kind of social enough and understood enough about the world that being outwardly wanting, I don't know, this was largely subconscious. I've unpacked a lot of this over the course of my career with the help of with a sports psychologist who was awesome. And so even if I mean, whatever it was I turned my hand to, there was this kind of, at the root of it all was this desire to want to be the best at it and to want to be perfect. But I didn't really notice it as that. It manifested itself in some really useful ways, like working hard. If you want to be the best at something, you tend to put a lot of time and energy and effort into it. So I'm grateful for that. But it also means that you're probably going to encounter quite a lot of fear and anxieties and, beyond nerves a lot of the time, which can inhibit your enjoyment of certain moments. I think rugby, I didn't tend to have that huge amount during the game, during the play. Like often there is a freedom that is associated with being in it. I used to play cricket at school. It was a great example because there's a lot more space, right, in the game. There's a lot more in between moments. And so the first, like, however many overs, if I was batting, felt incredibly isolated. And that desire to want to do really well, be the best and be perfect, was having an absolute field day. Because it's all that time to live its life. And it's not distracted by the fact that you've actually got to do stuff, because most of the time you're standing around at the crease. So I used to be so scared going out to bat. So yeah, it's been something that I've had to manage, but understanding that my brain works that way means I've got to the place where I can appreciate the benefits that sort of mindset has given me, and I can notice when it starts to become less useful and react and change my direction of travel accordingly.
You spoke a little bit there about it, but what drove you and what was the experience like of you going to a sports psychologist?
Yeah, I mean, we were lucky. We had a lady called Katie Warner who joined our team to work across the team, really. This would have been back in 2014, maybe, 2015, around then. And to begin with, it was largely team stuff. So it was just helping us understand a bit about the brain, the psychology, very basic level. But it was pretty useful, like understanding, the way our brain might react in the moment, but how we might want to react, or which bit of our brain might be more useful to make good decisions in game, things like that. I ended up doing some one-to-one stuff with and I thought I was going into it thinking, great, this is just going to help me be better at rugby. We're going to win more games like this. It ended up being pretty deep, ongoing work for a good while, or felt like a long while. I can't remember how many months it was where we really got into some stuff, but we ended up doing a process where we went all the way back to the childhood memories and things like that, which I'm not sure at what point I signed up for that, but it kind of, and it was really tricky, in all honesty. Like, there's some really challenging moments because part of it was reframing, re-understanding, or seeing my early years through a slightly different lens, and moving the jigsaw pieces around so that I was kind of seeing a different picture, and finding a picture that actually married up with my experiences now, so the way my mind was working now, and one that made sense. There's some pushback along the way. Like anyone who's gone through an experience like that might agree that there's some kind of resistance, because it's like, well, hang on, like I had this idea of my life as it's got here, and I was quite happy with that, and then but there's probably some bits that jigsaw pieces didn't quite fit. So in order to make those fit, you might have to undo the whole jigsaw a little bit and then put it all back together, and hopefully by the end you've found that all the pieces you've got fit a bit better now. And it's also easier to add new pieces into that jigsaw if you do that process. And that's kind of what I've found. And it was, it was essentially for me just like picking up on some behaviors, and then I think being in sport from a young age probably fostered this as well. So it was brilliant, and I'm like loved doing loads of sport. It was where I had so much fun. But actually, sport is also an accelerator for this kind of perfectionist mindset, because you've always got that dangling carrot of win or lose. So there's always an outcome that you can go after. There's always improvement. Whereas if you're into more, if you're an artist, I don't know, maybe it might be the same and all, but my experience of it, sport kind of probably fostered this perfectionist mindset. And the first step to working with it was separating myself from it a little bit. Like we used to kind of refer to it as perfect Tom, which, and have a bit of a laugh about it, because obviously that was unattainable. And then that was probably step one, was like recognizing that, or creating a bit of separation between my thoughts and myself. Coupled that with quite a lot of like meditation work, which I found pretty powerful. Again, just being more skillful with being able to allow thoughts to come and go. And that was a game changer for me, not just in terms of my rugby, but in terms of just life, how I'm able to parent, how I'm able to coach. Certainly, I think I'm probably just a better person as a result. So it's a really powerful process.
That's awesome. So it really did sort of sing to the approach that I'm a huge believer in, which is you sort the human being out first, then the athlete can be great second. And you felt that. So you did actually see an impact in your rugby. What was the sort of pre-work rugby player like to the post-work rugby player like?
Well, it wasn't like it wasn't chalk and cheese. It wasn't like I was rubbish and that was really good. Like I was actually probably, I think in terms of accolades and point scoring stuff, I probably did most of that in my early career, like before I did any of this. So maybe I got it totally wrong, but but I think that was largely down to people kind of figured me out a bit, but mostly around the leadership. So I was captain of the side from 2014. So I was, how old was I then? Like relatively young, like early 20s. Didn't really know my arse from my elbow, to be honest. Like on reflection, thought I was kind of mature and knew a lot about the world, and I'd done some cool stuff, but I didn't know a huge amount about myself, really. Like looking back, I hadn't done a lot of that self-discovery. I would have said I've always been quite self-aware, but this was the next level. So it just really improved the way I was able to lead and interact with people. But it wasn't a smooth process. I mean, we had in 2019 season, 18-19 season, we had the Olympic qualifying season. And the job that season was to finish top 4 in the World Series. So anyone who follows the series knows that you get points for each tournament. And then at the end of it, in that season, the top 4 got automatic qualification for the Tokyo Olympics. We were sort of 4th, we were 5th. We were like really close to that zone. And there was some other stuff going on. There was like a few distractions. Probably a bit of time in my career where I had a bit of like a career fatigue. We'd had the joy and the highs of Rio 2016, had a really good season off the back of that. And then we'd had the Sevens World Cup 2018. And then it was kind of just like a bit of a flat feeling going into that season, but it was Olympic qualifier, so I knew it was big. So I kind of had this double whammy of unuseful thoughts. One, not feeling as energized for the season as I had done naturally up to that point. The other thing being like the self-imposed pressure of needing, and then manifest itself as needing to qualify for the Olympics. And those things were basically leading me to try too hard. So I was on the wrong side of the edge. Like I was giving away penalties. I was probably trying to do a little bit too much myself. I was probably play with my shoulders quite close to my ears, like tense stuff. And it was a fraction. Like, it wasn't like I had like a horrible year. It was amazing moments I loved throughout that year, but there was definitely a running theme that I was just holding on to it too tightly. Anyway, we ended up coming fifth that at the end of the regular season, so we had to qualify through the European tournament that year. But my lead into that was, right, this is not going to go well for me or the team if I'm carrying this tightness and this kind of gripped up desire. Like, it was more than desire, it was a need for this qualification. So we did some good work as a team. I mean, I wasn't the only one in this play. Like, there was a bit of pressure on us. We'd done well in Rio, come back with the silver from Rio. So the thought that GB wouldn't have qualified for Tokyo was like, well, geez, this is like bad news if we don't get it. And everyone was very aware of that. And it's not something you get the chance to do every day, qualify for the Olympics. So there was a lot of tension across the team. I think we found out there was a lot of tension because we asked ourselves, on a scale of 0 to 100, if 100 is the worst thing you can ever imagine happening, where would not qualifying for the Olympics place on that? And there was a lot of 60s and 70s on that scale, and there was a good moment which I was reminded of, actually. One of the young lads who was probably knew he wasn't going to get picked for the Olympics this time around, and he'd just come in that year. He was loving life, like, comes straight out of school, and he was playing professional rugby. He was traveling the world playing seven. He was just living in the moment. And someone asked him, and he was like 4 or 5 out of 100. And obviously boys who've been in it for a bit longer, like 60, 70, completely lost perspective on what this was. So we did some good work as a squad that got us to a good place. And the difference between me coming out the back of the regular season and then a month or two later going to the European qualifier was massive. The tension had gone off. I felt like I was enjoying the rugby, and I didn't want it any less. Like, I still wanted to qualify, of course, but the blinkers had just come off a little bit, and there was a bit of light shining around, which I'd previously been closed off because I was so concerned with this goal that I'd locked onto. So that was a good lesson, but that was all post work. So that was post a lot of this psychology work I'd done. Now, it was a good lesson in needing the nudge occasionally. Like, I think I probably had a couple of years post Rio where I felt like I sort of figured some stuff out. And then in that 2019 season, just couldn't move on for myself for a large portion of it. And I needed a nudge. I needed some support. And I was fortunate I got it. And we had a good management team, including Katie, our psychologist, who did a bit of work with us around that time, whilst heavily pregnant, I think, at the time. So she was like putting the work in as well, to be fair. And it was a good lesson, because it's like that reminder that you never figure this stuff out. Like, there's no end point with any of this, right? And that's what I said about the jigsaw. Like, it's not like you've got the picture and that just lives with you forever. It's creating a picture that fits, that then has a nice look to it you can add to. And that's kind of how I think of it now.
Let's talk about leadership real quick. So I have no doubt there would have been a different Tom when you first went into it to then when you left. So if you have any, what would be some of the lessons of leadership that you've learned over your career?
Yeah. So I always pause before I give lessons, because my first lesson is not to try and emulate anyone too closely. So, like, everything I'm about to say should definitely be taken with a lens of, how does this apply to me, myself, my authentic self, and my behavior? Because that's kind of where I went wrong, I think. When I first started, it wasn't a problem. So I got given the captaincy. Definitely didn't think I was the person to do it at the time. Felt like I was too young, inexperienced, didn't really know what I was doing. Just focused on playing the game as best I could, and try not to sound silly in the team talks. That was kind of the extent of it when I started, and it ran pretty smooth. But then I was like, right, I've got to try and take my leadership to the next level, because that's what everyone says you're supposed to do. I also wanted to be, probably deep down, the best leader that any of the team had ever had. So that was still there. And it was when I started to work on it became tricky, because I was like, well, people say that this person's a good leader because they're like this. And it wasn't like I was exactly trying to be like someone else, but you try to adopt behaviors. I didn't really understand how certain people were saying you need to be more this or more that. And I was like, okay, yeah, I do. But I didn't really know how to do that. I didn't know how to be, it's a bit of a throwback reference, but like Martin Johnson is a leader for England rugby that people talk about. Like, I don't know Martin Johnson very well, but I'm pretty sure we're very different people. So what was the point of me trying to be him? It took me a long, long time to figure out that it was okay for your super strength as a leader of a rugby team to be compassion. Because most people said it had to be that you're going to make people, run through brick walls. Like, yeah, that's a cool skill to have. That's great. But if I didn't possess that, that's okay. It's also really cool to make people feel like you really care about them. And that might get the best out of them as well. But it took me quite a lot of time to kind of figure that out. And again, it's an uncomfortable, sticky process. There was a lot of self-doubt wrapped up in that as well. I remember there was a meeting we had. We're in Hong Kong before the Hong Kong Sevens, which was one of the biggest ones. And this is 2015. We had quite a young group out there, actually. We were rotating the squad a little bit. And I was desperate, as I said, like compassion. I was very democratic as a leader. I wanted to hear from everyone, give everyone a chance to raise their voice and to say what they wanted to say. We were having this goal-setting meeting before the tournament. We're in a hotel room. And it had been going on for about an hour. And you can imagine like young 20-something-year-old lads after an hour, like they're fully done. They just want to go to dinner. They want to go and play some table tennis or something. And I'm there like thinking, okay, everyone's had a say. I don't really know how to bring it to a close. I didn't really know what we need to land on as goal. I was like a little bit lost. And I was kind of, some people saying one thing, some people saying another thing. And what I probably should have done is jumped and said, right, hands up, who thinks we'll go with this? And then go with the majority and just made a call. But I was so desperate to like give everyone the chance and not like jump over anyone and not tell anyone too much what to do. I didn't want to be too dictatorial, maybe because I'd had some bad experiences with that leadership. But then one of the coaches ended up coming in and closing it off for me. And I just felt so worthless, felt so empty. And he was trying to help me out. Like he was trying to do the best thing, but I felt like he just like cut my legs off in front of everyone. And that was a massive learning experience. I'm so glad it happened because the biggest lesson I took away from that, come back to your question, is that you can afford to make mistakes as a leader. Like it is okay. In the same way as we talk all the time with athletes and the decision-making in game, it's okay to go down the track to a spinner and try and knock him back over his head for 6 if you think that's the right thing to do. If you get out, we'll unpick it afterwards and work out whether it was your technique, whether it was maybe the wrong ball to go for, the wrong context in the game. We'll work that out afterwards, but life will go on and you'll still be loved afterwards. I found that okay. I could understand that as an individual player. Like if I did a bad pass, I moved on. Like it didn't sit with me too much. But as a leader, there was something I felt about the consequences of whatever I did as a leader that felt more powerful. Because in some ways they are. Your job is to try and impact other people around you for the better. And I was so fearful of getting that wrong, so fearful of it impacting people in a way that wasn't useful for them. So I was passive for a lot of the time, like too scared to actually do anything, which in that meeting was a kind of case in point. So it was a brilliant lesson in that, like, go for stuff, like go with your gut, make a call. You can always make a mistake and learn from it, even when it comes to leadership and working with people. And kind of linked to that one is it's also a really useful thing to be open to your mistakes as a leader in front of your group. So some of the most powerful moments and the moments that moved me forward and dare say the team forward, where I sort of was like, I don't want to swear on the pod. I was about to swear on the podcast then, but lads,
can mate, you go for it.
Yeah, lads, like I messed up. I got that wrong. I'm sorry. At the time, my gut was telling me this, and I went with it. And that's on me. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to try and learn from that. And I'm pretty sure, like everyone's going to be like, yeah, no problem. It's going to be like, and if anyone doesn't, if anyone still holds that against you, that's on them.
Mm.
I think it's a sort of, again, these are all linked, but a final one I would put is, if your intentions are in a good place, then it makes the mistakes much easier. So as long as you've understood who you are as a person and who you're trying to be as a captain, largely based around your values and what you think is important, if you're guided by that when you're going into a situation, very hard to ever regret your actions. So I think that's a useful one to spend some time figuring out, like, actually what is important to me, and go with that. So what would be an example of that, just to make it kind of real for people? Like some of the lads for the England rugby team, I don't know when this is going to go out, but they've just done the squad selection for the Rugby World Cup. And, there would be some stuff around selection that would be really difficult. So for a coach in that scenario, I'd hope that the coaches would have thought, well, what's important to me as a person, as the leader of this group, and then done the selection accordingly. It doesn't mean that the people you're not selecting are going to be happy with your decision, but it means you can do it in a way where where you're demonstrating your values, whether that's like respect for other people, kindness, love. You can direct all those things whilst also delivering bad news. Whether the person receiving the bad news recognizes those things in the moment is another matter. I'd say almost certainly they won't, but hopefully down the line they might, and they will, and they'll be able to carry that forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I really like the values bit as well. I think that from whether you're a leader or captain or just an athlete in yourself, I've had some experiences, if I link it almost to a performance point as well, so away from almost leading people, but actually people going into performances with their values in their mind, because you can think about the technical, the tactical, the physical, whatever it is, but if you don't really play the game how you want to play it in accordance with the character and the human being that you are, there's going to be an element when you come off the field, you'll think, that wasn't me. That wasn't how I wanted to go about it. And I just didn't play. I wasn't me. I wasn't able to be me. And I think it's really important for people to have that values part of their puzzle figured out. And the earlier you can do it, I think the easier it becomes to take criticisms, to deal with tricky situations, to interact with coaches, other teammates, whatever it might be. And that experience becomes far easier because you can move on, you can move past it, because you've got a bit of a compass. You've got a compass guiding you in what's the decision I want to make here? How do I want to go about it? So if we were to take that example of you in that team meeting, like whatever your values were at that time, like, okay, if one of them is respect or you want to be clear, but having that sort of guidance through your values can really help someone get through an experience like that, because it can make you make the decision that may be unclear a bit clearer. I always think
100%.
I always think that's a nice little thing for not only leaders to have, but actually people that are being led as well.
Yeah, 100%. I think your values. Thinking of your values as like the compass is always pretty cool. I like that. Or like anchors as well. I mean, I think they give you like a good bit of stability, and it's closely linked to. We used to talk about our why a lot. Like, what's our why? What's our reason for doing this? What's our purpose? And I think if you can get to a point where you spend enough time with those things, talking about them, bringing them to your mind regularly, reviewing things based on those values as well. Like we used to do that as a team. Like, what are our values? And then the first thing we'd say is like, right, post game, did we hit our values? Boom, boom. And then we'd go into the technical stuff. And I think it's really good because then it becomes your decision-making guide subconsciously. So like, you're not even thinking, okay, you're not going through what's my values? What should I do? It just happens. You just become guided by them in a sense that you're almost oblivious to after a while, I think. Doesn't mean they don't change. Like, you have to reassess and readjust in periods, but I think it's a good use of time. And that's why I try to encourage the young guys I coach to do that now, is to like, actually, it's a hard thing to think about maybe when you're 14, 15. It's not a cool thing to talk to your mate about, but like, let's talk about what's important to you and what might be some things that you want to live by as values, and the dreams as well. Like, how often do we talk about young people, what their dreams are, and actually being guided by that in terms of their education, their sporting education, the way we behave as adults around them? Yeah, it's an interesting one.
Well, I think for younger people, because I know there are younger people that listen to this podcast, one of the ways in which I've found for younger athletes to be able to find their values, if it's too big a question for them to take on right now, is where the power of role models plays a huge part. Is pick someone in your life, whether that's someone that you see on TV or an athlete that you love, someone that you genuinely admire, and write down what you think it is that makes you admire them, away from the physical attributes of them being an incredible athlete, because you're not going to be at that level yet. Think about the way in which they go about it. And the funny thing is I think this is where a lot of people end up going towards the humility end of the spectrum. It's like, we love humble athletes. We love the Roger Federers, right? We love those that when they're finished, they're thanking their teammates. They're the ones that are thanking the ball boys and ball girls at Wimbledon, and the umpires and everything, and the people that organize the events, and they're really humble. And when you're talking to a young person, it's about drawing out those types of characteristics from their role models and go, right, well, if that's something that you think is a strong value in them, that could be something you want. So maybe humility is something you want to have. You want to be humble, stay grounded, and then you can start to unpack it from there. I think because you're right. It's probably too big a question for them to go like, well, who am I? What am I about? I'm 14 years old and I've only been on this planet for a little while.
Yeah, because who knows? Like even now, like someone said, "Who are you, Tom?" I'm like, well, where do we start? Where do we go now? But yeah, it's like spend time looking at who you admire, who your role models are, and not just looking at, their cars and their career success and the medals and the trophies, but actually what behaviors do they do is a useful one. Who would be some people you would have looked up to over the years, and behaviors that you would have, or values that you would have seen that you tried to emulate?
It's really interesting. I don't have loads of sporting heroes. I weirdly grew up being a West Indies cricket fan when I was younger, because my mum's best friend is from Barbados. So I actually, for a little while, thought I could play for West Indies. And it wasn't until the crashing knowledge came down on me that I actually was English and I may have to want to try and play for England. So I was like, damn it, I've been supporting West Indies for so long. So I had people like Curtly Ambrose and Courtney Walsh, who I loved as cricketers. But then when I've thought about this and unpacked it, I mean, I have a couple of fun two ways about this. I've the ones that I sort of really liked when I was younger, who were people like, I actually loved underdog stories of people like Messi. And originally there was an early advert done on Messi when he was really young through an Impossible is Nothing campaign at Adidas. And it was more about his hormone deficiency he had as a kid and overcoming that and playing the game. And I loved how he had used that to his advantage to make it. Stories like Jonah Lomu overcoming his diabetes, wasn't it? And was it diabetes? I can't remember.
I think he had was it kidney?
He had to be on dialysis. Sorry, he was on heavy dialysis machines, and he overcame that. There'll be someone that will definitely correct me from listening to this podcast, so I'm sorry for getting that one wrong. But yeah, the stories of Jonah Lomu, they were based on that as well. Weirdly, people like Lance Armstrong, which, yes, I've crossed that one off. And then another one which I crossed off my list was Oscar Pistorius, because I saw this guy who had no legs running against people with legs. Obviously, he's tarnished his reputation for what he did off the track. But I don't think it took away from what he actually accomplished on the track, because what he was doing running with no legs against people with it. Then character-wise, people I loved were Robin Williams and Jim Carrey. And the reason being was because they used humor in their most authentic way to be this larger than life character. And if I really look at me as a kid, I remember even getting parts in like a school play, and I wanted the craziest part in that school play. I wanted to be the Joker. I wanted to be the character that had the colorful clothing, and I actually think I've lost that a little bit growing up, and I'm trying my hardest to bring that back. And even in whether it's the podcast or content that I'm creating, I want to bring that out more and bring that out in the interactions I have with clients as well. So being that sort of off the wall character was something I think weirdly sport squashed in me. I think it took it out of me, built from the changing rooms, the rhetoric around the messaging of like, you have to be serious in order to be great. You have to be hardworking and serious in order to get this excellence, and missing the fact that you could be funny, jovial, off the wall. That's why I love people like Mark Wood at the England cricket team right now. I think Mark Wood's an amazing character in the sense that he just is him, like, and people love him for it. And I love the environment that he's been in to be able to be accepted as that and not squashed. Whereas environments that I went into squash that out of you through judgment, and that's not what's done around here.
Yeah.
Who were yours?
I can relate.
Who were yours?
I guess the main sporting role model I probably had, like if I was going to pinpoint one, would be Johnny Wilkinson.
Okay.
Which is really interesting because obviously some of the behaviors I was talking about around like perfectionism, not so far from his own experience. So I've kind of learned a lot from, I think I was fortunate in some ways. I was kind of I kind of learned a few of the lessons that he's learned, and I learned them kind of during my career, but I certainly, like, a lot of his story resonates. I think he's doing some really cool stuff at the moment. Like, see, he speaks a lot about self and some quite deep stuff, which I think, again, has challenged some people, like in rugby, because that thing you're talking about, conformity, I suspect there's still a lot of rugby clubs around the country that kind of write Johnny off now because it's like, wow, the stuff he's talking about, what kind of nonsense is that? I imagine is some of the conversation, because he is going to some deep places, some interesting places, some places that are quite challenging for people to probably get their heads around, both like intellectually, but also he might be questioning some things that are uncomfortable around the sport and our approach to it. But yeah, he would have been one. I think. I mean, he was just cool. I love the way he changed the game as a 10. I love the way he used to be super physical as a 10. I thought that I really respected that. Like, 'cause I was someone I wasn't physical. I've never been like really good at physicality, but I always had the kind of desire to be involved in as many moments as possible on both sides of the ball. And I think some of that was he learned from him, which was really cool. It was interesting, actually, when I think about like Olympic inspiration, because when you play rugby in this country, well, when I was anyway, you never grow up thinking the Olympics is going to be a thing. But as a fan of sports, the Olympics, especially around like the Sydney Olympics, I remember watching it thinking, God, I'd love to do that. What an amazing thing to be at the biggest sporting event in the world. And like, I still find it a ridiculous thing that sevens, like my love of sevens and the Olympics happen to merge and become, the stars kind of align to allow me to live that out. It doesn't quite feel real. And like, I've tried to talk about it quite a lot. Anyone who'll listen, just to try and make it feel real. But yeah, so I think role models for me weren't a massive thing in that respect. I think I was always more of a participator in sport than a fan as well. Like, I don't think I've ever considered myself a really good sports fan.
I 100% agree with this. The way you've just described that, I'm definitely in that camp as well. Like, I think of myself as being at games, like even when my dad would take us to go watch, whether it was a football match or a cricket match or rugby, and I'm more watching what was going on the sidelines, like with the coaching staff or the players on the bench. Almost like a rugby match, I'm watching the off the ball movements, like, because I was putting myself in sort of what's going on there. And then if it was like a cricket match, which is obviously a long format game, be playing with kids on the side of the ground, like throwing a ball around. And I just was more interested in playing. Like, I definitely think there's a value in, if you have the mindset of a fan for too long, you probably end up going to be one. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think there are geniuses in the sport that are just like addicted to their sports, but I think there's also a nice element of being kind of naive in your sport and sort of having a low knowledge of it as well, because you're just living it.
It might also speak to like the sport you watch and how engaging that is. I mean, I imagine there are a lot of kids now watching Test cricket that would actually want to watch some of the cricket, whereas however many years ago, they probably would have been looking around looking for something to entertain them. Whereas now they might be, and we need to think about that as rugby needs to think about that at the moment. I think it's trying to address it a little bit. Like, if you've got kids in the stands, how can you actually keep their eyeballs on the pitch rather than on the room and create a spectacle that people want to engage with? But just coming back to the individuality thing, you said, I think particularly male sport, but that's been my experience. I don't know if it's the same in women's sport, but the homogenous, like the encouraging of homogenous behaviours and this sort of sense of stereotyping is not useful. And not only does it deny you an amazing experience of humanity in life, but it's not useful for a team environment either. Best performing teams will have diversity of thought, diversity of background, often I think diversity of personality. And Sevens is, and there were times as a leader, by the way, where I was desperate for just people that were like me because it's easier, because you know how they think. I was probably on the diligent side, like traditionally professional, relatively speaking, I think. Whereas the more maverick types, or the guys that used to have a laugh, I'd find that a bit challenging, a bit triggering, because I felt it was like my place to sort of keep them in line a bit, and I didn't want to be that person. So, but I'm so glad they were in the team, because when you're away on a 2-week tour, wow, they're the people that make it enjoyable and make it fun, and they're also often the people that would deliver in the moments when you need them, and things like that. So you need all of it. And like, it's such a horrible thing that over the years we might have squashed some of this individuality out of people, even in terms of like the marketing and the promotion that we do around sport. This quite stale thing, we've had it in rugby for a while, and like now I think there's a really nice shift towards highlighting some pretty interesting characters, some cool characters that are involved in the game that might have been a bit risque or too risque kind of 10 years ago, but now we're getting to see the beauty of stories behind people's sporting lives, and that's what people want. That's what people thrive off, and it makes it more accessible as well. So I think the more we can do that, the better off we'll be.
I really get worried about the fact that young kids are seeing there's so much comparison of others. There's so much I want to be like the person next to me, and that messaging outside of the sport or just in society as well for them is only reinforcing that. It's look at what's here on Instagram, and why not be like this when being like you is not what you kind of want to be. There are some amazing, and I try to encourage especially young people to just clean their feeds to the message that they do wholeheartedly know is true, and the thing that they think they value. And so look for those people that are speaking the messages of individuality, whether it's taking on a podcast or a conversation like this, whether it's blocking or unfollowing someone that you think is saying the opposite message and telling you to look a certain way, be a certain way. I just see that there's a lot, even just in how people dress. I mean, fashion's fashion, but like I feel there is spectrums. There are people that are really expressive, and I live down south in Brighton. It's one of the most expressive cities in this country, right? So I see a really high end of that spectrum, but in younger people, I think there's definitely some work to be done in that individuality area.
I mean, obviously it makes sense, right? To want to conform to a degree, like we think of the way our brains have been designed, and survival over the years was being part of the group, and that's why often we don't want to exist outside the group, because it's the safe place to be, and to a large degree in society that's still the case. But beware the conformity. Comparison is a thief of joy, after all.
Exactly. Look, Tom, I'm really conscious of time, because you've got courses to get back to. You've got kids that are going to be waiting for you. I think it would be awesome if we could do a part 2 almost of this at some stage. Get you back on. There's loads of areas that I'm sure I'm going to think of coming out of this episode, but some that I haven't even touched on that I've been writing down notes throughout. So especially around pressure and sacrifices and things like that, I think there's definitely way more that we could dive into. And if you're keen to do that, I'd love to have you back on in the future.
Yeah, super keen. And also, if this one goes out before we do another one, I'd be cool to hear what's resonated with people or relevant or people want to hear more of, because I'll quite happily talk about anything, but probably nice to make it relevant for people listening.
Yeah, for sure. Where just before we wrap this one up and we send you off, where is the best place to send people if they want to watch more of what you're doing and keep up to date with you? So sort of signpost them towards the best place to find you.
Instagram is probably the best at the moment. So at TR Mitchell. Don't know what my current profile picture is. Probably still me playing rugby, which I need to update because I'm no longer a professional rugby player. So got to let that go.
But
that's something we'll get into the next one, actually.
Yeah, I also the changing hairstyles. I think that's something that, yeah.
I showed a video this week, actually, to the coaches. And I had to point out in the video which one was me because I had a very cropped, smart haircut. And yeah, maybe I need to go back to that. I don't know. Maybe that'll be conforming too much. I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah. Look, this has been awesome. I really appreciate your time, and I'm actually really psyched that you would come back on and we can get another episode done.
Cheers, Lewis. Thanks for having me, mate. I've loved it.
Awesome.